Cool. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and hello, everybody. I'd like to say I'm on Ngunnawal lands today, speaking from Ngunnawal lands, which are very wet at the moment. So I don't represent a particular collection anymore, but over my career, I've had the pleasure of working with vehicle collections in public museums, in private hands, in volunteer museums. And at the moment, I'm doing a research project, which we're calling Mind the Gap, where we're looking at the interaction between operating machinery heritage and legislation and regulation. So that's bringing me in. We have a industry reference group, and that incorporates people from all those groups. Is really interesting. If anyone is interested in joining us for that, we're always interested in hearing from you. So feel free to contact me after this session. Yes, so just that private collections, public collections, volunteer collections. So over time, I've realized that there are subtle differences between these contexts in their responsibilities and their capacities and the choices they make. So today I want to talk about these differences between public and private collections and how these might influence our approach to the future of vehicle heritage. And I'm going to say not all the slides I use are of automotive, so please forgive me for that. Firstly, responsibilities. So people who actually own the technology they work on have a lot more freedom to play and to take risks with their objects. And that goes back to Nathan's talk about risk and risk aversion. And people who own their own technology have much more freedom to make their objects exciting and really accessible in ways that are rarely considered acceptable in publicly owned collections. Now, this is often seen as a matter of professionalism, but I'd like to argue it's actually one more to do with context. So to look at when people have personal responsibilities, they own their technology, or they're working with a volunteer group that owns its own collection. They're mostly doing it because they really love these objects, and through that love, they want to derive personal gain from them. And that personal gain can be in the form of pleasure or pride. If they sell them, money. So they really want their work on their objects to be appreciated. They take a lot of pride in good work, and sharing that success socially provides a basis for social connection and support. And they do things like they want their families and friends to be able to interact with these objects. So get sensory engagement, go on rides, touch them, smell them, hear the sound. They want to have drives and picnics in them or with them. And for people working on them, that's sharing skills, doing mechanical rebuilds together, maintenance, and also things like artistic expression. It's not necessarily all about history. And utility vehicles like dozers, and the tank I just showed you, are often used to actually do something. The dozers often push some earth around. The tanks sometimes squash cars. That was actually in Germany. For many of these objects, or many of these people, if the objects get dirty or break, caring for them is part of the deal, and it often becomes part of the story. So a big part of these private and volunteer collections is these aspects of personal gain, which I would say are fun and expressing your own values and being creative, as well as, or even instead of being historic. And this is, of course, the Daimler from the NMA. Thank you, Nathan. Just using your my photos of your lovely vehicle. When people are embedded in professional public collections, the emphasis is on quite literally public service. Because the collection belongs to the wider community and it's a public asset, it's not considered appropriate to use it for personal gain. And that's both a legal thing, and it's also in terms of being seen to do the right thing. And that's most explicit in regards to financial gain, but that principle colours all the dealings with the object. So it's not considered appropriate to derive personal satisfaction and enjoyment from the object, to express your values as opposed to the museum's, to hold your own events using the object. It's not appropriate to invite your friends to ride in it. It's not appropriate to drive it where you want. And it's usually not appropriate to eat and drink at it. And the reason for this is that all these things connote, or the reason I think is sort of behind it in an unwritten way, is that all these things connote ownership and control of an object because they're privileged access. And it's not that museums don't allow these activities, but they're sanctioned by appropriate museum authorities. The right person has got to sign off, and they're implemented using agreed museum procedures. And that's all the things that Nathan was talking about, the risk management procedures and the, who has the qualifications to drive these procedures. There's a whole raft of procedures. And what those procedures do, apart from managing risk and so forth, they make it clear that the museum is the owner. And they make it clear that privileges like this are extended on a reciprocal basis, not just because you personally want to have fun with it, but because the collection will get appropriate benefits in return. There might be money donated, or it gets publicity, or whatever. And those processes, again, make it clear that potential risks to the object have been assessed and appropriately managed. And that all makes it sound very formal. And in practice, I know the staff typically have huge amounts of fun using the objects to provide activities to the public. But it's the context of service that makes that okay. They are providing those activities to the public as part of their service to the public through the public collection. So people who work in public institutions, it's interesting. And this is coming out particularly through our industry reference group in our Mind the Gap project, tend to have perhaps a broader and more flexible outlook than people who work with private or volunteer collections. But people in the private sphere tend to have more specialized and focused skills and understandings. When I was talking about the relative lack of freedom for people working in professional institutions, and it sounds like a real downer, but it does have an upside. They're really used to seeing other people's points of view, and that could be colleagues within the museum, it could be the audiences that are coming to see their objects, and it could be the regulators they have to interact with and satisfy. So they're really used to looking for solutions that are a reasonable compromise, rather than being perfect for one very embedded stakeholder. And they're often quite relaxed about compromising, perhaps because it doesn't affect them so personally. It's not their object that is being the compromise is being made about. And there's a caveat there. This is not so true of people trained as materials conservators. I should know, I'm one, who tend to get very stressed about any physical changes that operating a heritage object brings. But I'll come back to that later. But otherwise, apart from that group, this is a world that involves a lot of organizing, a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of talking. Those things are commonly called in the business world transferable skills. And to be good at this, to have those transferable skills, you don't actually have to know a lot about any one machine or machinery type. In fact, it often helps if you're not too focused on one machine, because you don't get too narrow or fixated or attached to one particular type of technology. And you're likely to have what I call grazing experience to draw on. So exposure to a variety of projects, a variety of objects, a variety of solutions and outcomes. But what they don't have typically, not always, but often, is a deep understanding of the machinery that is in the collection. And this is what private and volunteer collections really have. They typically, in my experience, focus on one type of machine, sometimes one period, sometimes even one make of machine. And individual people often only have one or two machines that like their personal collection is one or two machines, and they pour their time and money into them. And this means they know that machine really well. They don't just know its technical specs, but they know its individual personal quirks. They're really familiar with its capacities and its failure triggers. They know where its maintenance is up to, often to the hour. They have specialist tooling and spare parts and facilities that are all tailored to taking care of it and running it safely. And they often, usually if they're within a society or volunteer museum, have a supportive community around them that's also knowledgeable about their machine type and who will usually share skills and parts and time. And that reciprocity makes everyone feel good. It's lovely. Now, I would suggest that both of these skill sets, both the public broader one and the private volunteer more focused one, are essential to a successful and sustainable vehicle collection. So it's a pity they so rarely go together. And I reckon that there are two aspects of this. One is the focus versus the diversification, and one is preserving physical material versus intangible heritage. Now, firstly, to think about the focused collections. Private volunteer collections, as I've said, tend to be quite focused. They're shaped by the capacities and interests of their members, and that includes the members' financial situation. It includes their liking for vehicles that they may have worked with in the past, so past lives, past skills. And sometimes it includes vehicles that give them access to, well, often it includes vehicles that give them access to particular social groups and activities. So sometimes if people are really interested in, say, doing some World War II role play activities, dressing up in the uniforms and acting out a bit of role play there, they might purchase a machine that will allow them to become part of a society which does that. But whatever it is, overall they tend to stick to one type of thing, which limits how much they have to diversify their resources. On the other hand, and I love this slide, there's just everything in there. The professional collections try to be representative. So they tend to have one of each key make or type or period, or vehicles that represent or symbolize key people or events or technological developments. And they like vehicles that can be used to tell multiple stories. And again, Nathan gave us an example of that. I think it was with the Citroën. But what that means for those public collections is that their staff are always on the bleeding edge of their knowledge. And that's a real time and money cost, because they will get a new vehicle, it's from a new type, they haven't got specialist tooling for it, they've got to do a lot of trial and error because they're not so familiar with it, they don't know the shortcuts with it, they have to take a lot of caution because they're not so familiar with the hazards and vulnerabilities, and they're always expanding the skills and the tooling that they require. And interestingly, my experience is that even within the museum itself, that creates the perception that the staff working to preserve and to get those vehicles operating are inefficient. Actually, they're just learning, constantly learning. But it does mean that they can't take advantage of any economies of scale. So the second part of this, as I was saying, is the preservation of physical material versus intangible heritage. In professional contexts, people usually have professional heritage training, and that, if you go right back, comes from a tradition that emphasizes the preservation of physical fabric. And that's amazing. Like a forensic study of materials and wear and paint layers allows you to unpick and verify a vehicle's history. And also those parts that were used during the vehicle's life are seen to be authentic. They come from back in the day, they were there. The preservation of intangible heritage is actually still quite new in the professional heritage space in terms of, you know, the lifetime of people's careers, when they trained, all that sort of thing. It's still relatively new. It came originally from First Nations peoples. And interestingly, if you look at things like, you know, the UNESCO definition of intangible heritage and so forth, it's still largely seen to be, what people have actually said to me is, oh, I thought that was mostly songs and dances. And the other one is traditional folk crafts. They don't tend to think of it as mechanical skills and understandings and tacit knowledge around machinery use and operation. So in a public museum or in a professional sense of a collection, the loss of intangible mechanical heritage when a machine is not operated is not actually seen, and it's not perceived. And if it is seen, the associated changeability is often perceived as reducing authenticity because it requires replacement and repair of parts of that physical material, and because it will cause wear and it may cause breakage. So for these people, the idea of preserving operability at the expense of the authentic original materials seems like losing the most significant aspect of the object. Whereas in private collections, the situation, I would say, is almost reverse. Because people in private collections, they're operating the vehicles, they see the intangible heritage. They see the practice of mechanical trade skills and knowledge. They experience the moving machinery. They experience the excitement and creativity associated with their vehicles. And for that for most people in this world is the most important thing. The changeability that's associated with that in the terms of the physical materials is considered normal. It's part of a tradition of maintenance and upgrades and refits and adaptations that's normal in that context. And it's fun. So for these people, the idea of preserving nothing but the physical shell of a machine, that seems like losing the most significant aspect of it. So what do I draw from this? Mostly that people's activities in these public and private contexts are different because their different responsibilities and capacities prompt them to make different choices. Not right or wrong choices, just different. But I will say that I think today there seems to be a perception that management mechanical skills are the core skills for being involved with vehicle heritage, and that people without these skills are only really useful to stave off the requirements of a modern obsession with paperwork. Again, that comes back to what Nathan was saying. It comes back to what I think was David McKenzie was saying. There's a lot of paperwork involved, but it's not seen as central. The central skills are your mechanical skills. This perception is rife in public collections just as much as in private and volunteer context, believe me, because and it works a slightly different way. But anyway, it limits the pool from which we can recruit heritage vehicle lovers, because people without much mechanical skill, which includes many younger people and will include more and more younger people, because as Nathan pointed out, cars with or automotives and other machinery with internal combustion engines are going to get rarer and rarer. Even today, vehicles are so reliable, and most people, the majority of people live in cities. They don't need to do their own mechanical repairs. They often can't because the heavily computerized cars make that impossible, and the current sort of industry way of repairing things is take one off, put one on, rather than actually repair something. So there's a whole lot of mechanical skills that are not going to be there more and more. So these people don't see our collections as vehicles for their own self-expression because their skills are not viewed as real vehicle skills. And I'm going to raise the idea that I think this is a consequence of passing time. The vehicles that we love and want to preserve got where they are because of an equal mix of mechanical and non-mechanical skills. Because of people who did car designs, which were creative artworks, who funded their manufacture, who developed the ad campaigns that sold them, who managed the logistics of storing and shipping parts, and who managed the pay packets of the people who did have the mechanical skills who were on the production floor. And so I suggest that the historic vitality of the automotive industry, which is huge, was because it was well supplied with all these different people, and that heritage automotive collections today and things like their archives are vulnerable because by and large they only have the people with the mechanical skills. So they're not managing well for things like financial and succession planning, risk management, anticipating and commenting on regulatory change, and using new opportunities like social media and online events. Equally, within public collections, there often seems to be an expectation that operational automotive collections will run themselves or only need one part-time person or a few volunteers. So before they buy a vehicle, public museums might undertake a significance assessment and purchase cost analysis, but doesn't necessarily cost in the time and the tooling necessary for maintenance, which isn't glamorous and will not get in the news, but will always be needed. So I just think that we need to look at the strengths of both the public and private contexts and draw from both of them to create a more balanced skill pool and value those skills for all their contributions. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have a question for Alison on her presentation at all? Nicholas Scarf, ask your question of Alison.
Hi, Alison. My name's Nick, and I'm doing my Masters in Automotive History with Harriet as one of my supervisors. And it's really interesting you were talking about sort of the intangible versus the tangible history. My goal career-wise is to work with a public or a private collection, and I sort of straddle the line. I see the importance of preserving physical, the physical and the physical material of vehicles, but I'm also a car enthusiast myself, and I own and operate classic vehicles and restore classic vehicles as my hobby. And I was wondering if you thought or believe that there's sort of a place for allowing within, or if museums felt that there was a place for limited use of vehicles, or if that's increasing, because of course one of the things that I get a lot in club context when talking about this is, cars in museums just sit there and they do nothing, and that's actually worse for them from a preservation standpoint than them actually being used occasionally. You see more deterioration of components and things like that over time. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a passion of mine too. And interestingly, the way I have realized there's so much material in the world of contemporary art. Now, doesn't that sound like an odd mix-up? But I've ended up writing a paper with a colleague of mine who works in the preservation of time-based art. And what I realized, she's actually one of my students, and what I realized when we were talking about her projects and the literature in the art world about this very issue, they have exactly the same issue. Different types of objects, art versus utilitarian objects, but all the problems of if you let them sit and do nothing, they quickly deteriorate, and then they're not, they need a big restoration and a lot of replacement of parts to get them going again. Obsolescence in her area is particularly big, with changes in digital technology and projection technology and all that sort of thing. So we wrote a paper looking at the issue of changeability and how important we think it is to preserve changeability. So not saying, oh, this isn't a bad thing to do, but saying this is a positive thing we have to do. To preserving changeability. Changeability is essential to these items. It doesn't mean every single item has to operate, but preserving that understanding of changeability is absolutely as critical as preserving all the physical materials. And I think that's a way that is really helpful in the museum context, because it fits into that theoretical discussions and the theoretical tradition that museum people are usually trained in, that there's actually a distinct quality here that needs to be preserved.
Definitely, that's encouraging actually to hear that, because I was a bit worried that I'm going to get stuck, in a situation where I believe that we need to preserve vehicles and as much of the physical aspect of the vehicles as possible. I mean, in what the classic car world, I'm what's called a purist as much as possible. But also, this idea that I don't think they should sit there doing nothing for decades and decades on end. So it's good. Yeah. Thank you very much for answering that.
Daryl Meek.
Alison, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned towards the end that sometimes some of the more important aspects of the management and maintenance of these private and institutional collections is not so much about the mechanical aptitude of the owners or the volunteers, but sometimes, and it's certainly my experience, that just as important are the business and management and other skills that are perceived as perhaps intangible. Would you like to make a comment on perhaps the importance of, especially in volunteer organisations, the needs for a skills assessment to actually be undertaken to make sure the collection or the archives or the display is a success?
I think it's absolutely necessary, but I think my main point is that those skills have to be valued. So I have come across quite often the sense of, we have to do this because it's demanded, to fit in with this modern world. It's all paperwork. We should be able to focus on the mechanical stuff, but we can't because we have to do all this paperwork. And so I think what I was trying to do was return to a context where these vehicles were initially made, which was not just mechanical skills, but involved all these other skills. There were people who planned, people who got the money, people who did the paperwork, people who liaised with the insurers and the lawyers. And I do think that because people love the mechanics so much, they've tended to forget that. And I think that's really important to perhaps put it back in the context of we used to have an environment, a complete, a holistic vehicle manufacturing and maintenance environment that involved all these other people, and they supported it and they enabled it. And we're doing it really hard without those people, but we won't get them back unless we centralize their skills and see it not just as an onerous task that we have to do to tick boxes, but we have to say it's an exciting task that we will really value and will complement and enhance what we do on the mechanical side.
Thank you. Terrific answer. Thank you.
Great. I think unless I don't think we have any more questions, Alison, I think we might leave it at that. But thank you so much for such a great presentation.